Story 1. The Grist of the Mill. Willa returned to Cold Hollow clutching the deed to the old family mill like a ticket to a future she desperately needed to believe in. Her city life had crumbled. A divorce, a career in ashes, a bank account gasping its last. The mill, left by a great uncle she'd met once as a child, was a Hail Mary. A place to start an artisanal flower business, the blogs promised. A simple, honest life. The mill was not simple. It hunched over Blackwater Creek like a stone golem, its great waterwheel skeletal and still. The air inside was cold and damp, smelling of wet stone, old timber, and something faintly sweet, like rotten rye. The massive grinding stones, the runner and the bedstone, were veined with dark mineral streaks. Local folks in the scant town 5 miles down the road were polite but distant. When she mentioned the mill, a veil dropped over their eyes. Old man Riddle at the general store just shook his head. "Grindstone mill's been quiet a long time, miss. Some stones are best left unturned." But Willa had no choice. She poured her remaining savings into repairs. The wheel groaned back to life. The gears, thick with hardened hog fat grease, began to turn. The first batch of locally sourced organic wheat was a disaster. The flour came out gray and bitter, speckled with black grit no sieve could catch. Desperate, she tried rye. The flour was better, but a strange, coppery scent hung in the mill after grinding. That night, she dreamed of the stones turning not with grain, but with small, white bones. The change began with the creek. Blackwater Creek ran clear above the mill, but below the wheel, the water flowed the color of weak tea, and it left a rusty, metallic stain on the rocks. The few fish that swam past the millrace were blind, their eyes clouded over with a milky film. Willa started finding curious things in the grain hopper before grinding. Not just field stones, but a tarnished silver locket, a Civil War-era minié ball, a child's petrified leather shoe. Then came the harvest moon. A local farmer, lean and desperate as she was, brought a sack of a peculiar, dark-grained corn he called Bloody Butcher. "It's all that'll grow in the back 40, he muttered, not meeting her eye. Mills always had a taste for it. That night, under the orange gaze of the moon, Willa fed the dark corn into the mill. The stones ground with a different sound, a low, satisfied hum that vibrated in her teeth. The cornmeal that poured out was the color of dried blood and smelled rich, earthy, profoundly good. She baked a small cake with it. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, a flavor that spoke of deep, fertile soil and secret, nourishing rains. She sold the batch in town the next day. By noon, it was gone. People came back, their earlier reticence gone, replaced by a hungry, eager light in their eyes. They paid in cash, in heirloom silver, in jars of honey that tasted of mountain wildflowers. But the mill demanded balance. The creek below the wheel now ran a deep, sanguine brown. Willa began to hear whispers in the constant rumble of the stones. Not words, but echoes. The thud of earth on a pine box, the sob of a lost child, the clink of a shovel on bedrock. The farmer who brought the Bloody Butcher corn was found dead in his field, his body pale and drained, the rich soil around him dark and wet. Willa knew she should stop. But the mill was profitable now. It was giving her a life. And the hunger the meal stirred in her customers was in her, too. She ate it every day. She felt stronger, more rooted, but also more attuned to the mill's whispers. She learned its history from the echoes. It had ground grain for Confederate holdouts, for moonshiners, for desperate settlers during the Depression. It had ground more than grain in lean times. The stones remembered every sacrifice made to them, every secret ingredient added to the hopper to ensure the flour didn't fail. One bleak December day, a man came to the mill. He was from the State Environmental Agency. He held a vial of Blackwater Creek water, taken below the mill. "Contaminants," he said. "Heavy metals, strange organic compounds. We're shutting you down. This is a hazard." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through Willa. The mill couldn't stop. It wouldn't allow it. The hum of the stones rose to a keen. That night, as the man camped in his car by the road, Willa stood before the hopper. The whispers were a chorus now, instructive. The mill needed a final, potent offering to settle the debt, to bind the man's silence, to ensure its survival. It needed the grist that had sustained it through its hungriest winters. She didn't make a conscious choice. The hunger and the whispers made it for her. She lured the man inside with talk of paperwork, her movements smooth, her mind a silent, cold creak. The stones were waiting, humming their ancient, grinding song. The next morning, the mill ran. The water below the wheel ran clear for the first time in months. A new, exquisite batch of bloody butcher meal, finer and more fragrant than any before, sat in sacks by the door. Willa bagged it, her hands steady. Down in town, they would be waiting, their mouths watering for the unique, irreplaceable taste only grindstone mill could provide. She had saved her future. She had become the mill's keeper, its priestess. And as she swept a trace of dark, granular dust from the floorboards, she knew with a certainty that settled in her bones like settled flour, the mill would never be hungry again. It had finally remembered how to feed itself. Story 2. The Galt Line. The Galt farm had been a wound in Eli's family for generations. His great-grandfather won it in a poker game, his grandfather died there in a threshing accident, and his father fled it at 16, swearing the very fence posts whispered curses. Now, with his father dead and no other heirs, the 200 scrub-choked acres in a nameless West Virginia hollow were Eli's problem. He saw it as a clean break. Sell the cursed land, pocket the money, and fund his escape to a coastline as far from mountains as possible. The real estate agent, a slick man from Charleston, lasted one afternoon. He called Eli from his car, voice shaking. "The survey pins, they're moving. My GPS goes haywire. And there's lines scratched in the dirt everywhere. I'm out." The lawyer handling the estate was next, coming to assess the assets. He was found wandering the county road 2 days later, shoeless and babbling about the map that wouldn't stay still. The sheriff, a weary man with eyes the color of creek slate, advised Eli to just let it go fallow. "Some land ain't meant to be owned, son. The Galt place, it's got a bad survey." That phrase stuck with Eli. A bad survey. He was a freelance graphic designer, a maker of clean, logical digital spaces. The irrationality of it grated on him. He drove to the farm, determined to confront the nonsense. The old cabin was a sagging skeleton of logs. And everywhere, on the packed earth of the yard, along the overgrown stone fences, in the mud of the creek bank, were the lines. They were grooves cut into the earth, about an inch deep, too straight and precise to be animal tracks or erosion. They formed rectangles, triangles, intersecting grids that made no sense. They didn't correspond to property lines, old foundations, or anything on the tattered survey map he'd inherited. They just were. And they were different from the photos the agent had taken just a week before. It was as if the farm's floor plan was being feverishly, constantly redrawn by an invisible, obsessive cartographer. That night, in the musty cabin, Eli's laptop, running on a groaning generator, flickered. His design software opened by itself. On the screen, Lines began to appear, white on black, vector perfect. They mirrored the new set of scratches outside his window. A cold knot formed in his gut. He tried to close the program. It wouldn't let him. A new layer opened, and more lines drew themselves, this time in red, overlaying the first set at sharp, dissonant angles. A message box popped up, text typing itself in a font made of jagged, mineral-like pixels. Resurvey in progress. Stand by for final platting. Eli smashed the laptop shut. The generator died. In the profound, smothering silence of the hollow, he heard it. A slow, grating drag, like a heavy stone being pulled through dirt, right outside the door. The next day, he tried to leave. His truck, which had run perfectly, refused to start. The dirt road leading out was now blocked by a sprawling, fresh-cut network of lines that extended across the path and up the trunks of the trees on either side, as if defining a new, unwanted gateway. His phone showed no service. The world beyond the hollow seemed to soften, to blur, like a poorly rendered image. The farm was resurveying itself, and it had included him in its new boundaries. Panic gave way to a dreadful, creeping understanding. The lines weren't random. They were claims. Each new set carved a revised reality. He found a rusty coffee can buried near the porch. Inside were brittle pages from his grandfather's journal. Pa always said the original surveyor for this land, a man named Galt, used a compass that pointed to what wanted to be there, not what was. He didn't map the land, he mapped its hunger. He drew lines around its desires, and now it tries to redraw them, to claim what it thinks it was promised. Asterisk. Eli began to see the changes. A stand of pines within a freshly scratched polygon overnight became skeletal, blackened trunks, as if they'd been dead for decades. A section of creek within a triangular claim now flowed uphill, silent and thick as oil. The farm wasn't haunted by ghosts, it was haunted by a deed asterisk, a corrupted legal document made flesh in the land itself. It was trying to correct its description, to expand its existential borders, and it was using the physical world, and him, as its drafting paper. He realized the only way out was to become a surveyor himself. He found Galt's old, brass surveyor's compass in the ruins of a toolshed. Its needle didn't point north. It spun slowly, then quivered, pointing toward the heart of the cabin. Eli, using a kitchen knife, began to scratch his own lines. He didn't try to fight the farm's patterns. Instead, he added to them, carefully, precisely. He drew a narrow, single-line corridor from the cabin door, following the compass's pull, which now pointed to a blank patch of ground near the creek. For hours, he worked, etching his proposed easement. The land resisted. The dirt became hard as concrete. Unseen forces tugged at the knife. The existing lines around him pulsed and shifted, trying to incorporate his corridor into their mad grids. But he persisted, his designer's mind focused on the simple, clean logic of a path out. As he finished the final scratch, connecting his line to a small, innocuous circle he'd drawn, the grating sound returned. It came from the circle. The ground there softened, becoming loose, dark soil. The compass needle dropped from his hand and stood upright in the center of the circle, humming. It was a trade, a proposition. The farm's hunger, defined by Galt's original sin, was for order, for definition, for a perfect, settled plat. It had been trying to complete its messed up paperwork for a century. Eli had just submitted a revised document. He understood. He took the deed from his pocket, the paper that gave him nominal ownership of this nightmare. He folded it into a tight square and buried it in the soft soil of the circle, next to the vibrating compass. He placed a stone on top, A crude monument. The world snapped back into focus. The blur at the edge of the hollow cleared. His truck engine turned over on the first try. The lines in the dirt didn't vanish, but they stilled, frozen in their latest configuration. Eli drove out and never looked back. He made it to the coast. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he opens his new computer to a blank screen. And sometimes, just for a second, he sees a faint, ghostly line draw itself from one edge to the other, as if something is still checking its boundaries, ensuring its claim is properly recorded. He sold his inheritance, all right. He just didn't specify what he was selling it to. The Galt farm now owns itself, perfectly and legally, according to the final plat he helped file. And somewhere in a West Virginia hollow, a compass points forever to a buried deed, and the land, at last, is satisfied with its survey. Story 3. Knitting the Bone. Marla came to the high, lonesome cabin to care for her Granny Hester, who was dying of the mountain's common euphemism, the long decline. The doctors in town said it was a mosaic of age and attrition, but Marla knew it was the mountain itself, slowly calling back one of its own. Granny Hester was a knitter. Her hands, gnarled as oak roots, had never been still. Even as she faded, propped in her rocker by the fire, the ivory needles clicked, pulling loops of coarse, undyed wool from a basket by her feet. "What are you making, Granny?" Marla asked on her first day, unpacking her suitcase in the tiny loft. "What needs making, child?" Hester replied, her voice like wind through dry cornstalks. "Always what needs making." The blanket on Hester's lap was large and strangely shaped. It wasn't a square or rectangle, but an uneven, sprawling form. The stitch was unlike anything Marla had seen. Dense, convoluted, forming ridges and valleys in the wool. It looked, unsettlingly, like a topographic map. Or a large, flattened skeleton. Marla's duty was simple. Keep the fire, prepare the thin broths Hester could stomach, and wind the endless skeins of wool that seemed to multiply in the basket. The wool was local, Hester said, from the few sheep old man Creat kept in the high meadow. It had a greasy feel, lanolin rich, and a faint, musky smell. As she wound, Marla's fingers would sometimes catch on burrs or tiny, stiff twigs woven into the fiber. The click was the cabin's heartbeat. It went on all day and, Marla soon discovered, all night. She'd wake in the pitch dark of the loft to the sound, steady and relentless, from below. Once, she crept down and saw Hester in the firelight, her eyes closed, her breath shallow, but her hands moving with automatic, spider-like precision. The blanket had grown. It now spilled off her lap and pooled on the floorboards. In the flickering shadows, the raised stitches didn't just look like ridges, they looked like ribs. Granny Hester worsened. Her breathing became a ragged drag. The doctor from town made the long trip, shook his head, and left pain medicine that Marla dutifully administered, though it seemed to have no effect on the knitting. The blanket was now enormous. Marla had to help shift its weight as it consumed more and more of the room. The shape was undeniably organic. A long, central spine, branching limbs, a widened basin for a pelvis. It was a ghostly, woolen anatomy laid out on the floor. "It's for the cold, ain't it?" Marla whispered one evening, gripping her granny's papery hand. The old woman's eyes opened, milky with cataracts but sharp with a terrible knowledge. "The cold comes for us all, sugar," Hester rasped. "But the mountain is particular. It gives us clay, and it expects the clay back. But it don't want it broke." Her hand squeezed with surprising strength. "My mammy taught me. Her mammy taught her. We knit the bone so the mountain knows its own. So the holler stays quiet." That night, The clicking stopped. Marla found her in the morning, cold and still in her rocker, a peaceful expression on her face. The knitting needles lay crossed on her chest. And the blanket was complete. It was a perfect, woolen human form, lying supine before the dead fire. It had no head, but the rest was disturbingly accurate. Shoulders, chest, the gentle cage of the ribs, the long taper of legs, the subtle articulation of feet. Trembling, Marla called the funeral home in town. They said they'd come up the next day, weather permitting. A spring storm was blowing in. As the day faded, the wind began to howl down the chimney, and the first sleet tapped at the windows. The cabin grew bitterly cold. Marla built up the fire but couldn't chase the deep chill from the stones of the hearth. As full dark fell, she heard a new sound. A dry, rustling scrape. It came from the center of the room. She turned, the firelight painting the walls in frantic, dancing shadows. The woolen form was moving. It wasn't alive. It had no will. It was as if a powerful, invisible wind was blowing through it, filling it. The limbs settled, the spine arched slightly off the floorboards. The dense, convoluted stitch of the ribs seemed to expand and contract, once, twice, in a mockery of breath. Terror locked Marla in place. This was Granny Hester's last work. Not a blanket, but a receiver. A pattern laid down to catch something the mountain was sending back. The form began to solidify. The greasy wool darkened, taking on a waxy, yellowish hue. The smell of lanolin was replaced by the scent of wet earth and old mushrooms. The shape lost its fuzzy definition, the stitches merging, becoming seamless, becoming surface. It was no longer wool. It was becoming tallow, or soapstone, or something for which there was no name. With a final, wet snap, the transformation ceased. Lying on the floor was a perfect, life-sized effigy of her grandmother, carved from something between aged ivory and polished limestone. It was Granny Hester, down to the wrinkles on her hands, the curve of her jaw, the peaceful set of her mouth. A mountain-made cenotaph. The storm raged outside, but the cabin fell silent. The terrible cold receded. The fire crackled warmly. The mountain had taken its clay, and in its meticulous, geological way, it had given a receipt. The holler was quiet. The next morning, the men from the funeral home found Marla sitting calmly by the fire. Granny Hester's body was still in the rocker, ready for them. They never saw the stone figure. Marla had already, as per instructions she now understood in her bones, dragged it to the family plot behind the cabin and with great effort, rolled it into the open grave that waited beside her grandfather's. It was heavy, impossibly so, the true weight of a life lived in one place. As they drove away with the mortal shell, Marla looked back at the cabin. On the porch, in Granny Hester's rocking chair, sat the basket of wool. The ivory needles poked from a fresh, coarse ball of undyed yarn. The wind sighed through the pines, a sound like a steady, patient, click click click. The mountain work was never done. And now, Marla knew the pattern. Story 4. The Judas Road. The preacher man came to Redemption Hollow with a Bible in one hand and a geologist's hammer in the other. Reverend Amos King saw not a dying Appalachian community strangled by kudzu and meth, but a promised land. His new flock, the lambs of the new covenant, needed a sanctuary. And the vast, abandoned coal holdings of the Redemption Mountain Consolidated Company, purchased for pennies from a bankrupt shell corporation, were perfect. Isolated. Defensible. Theirs. Lena, born and raised in the hollow, watched them arrive from the porch of her trailer. She saw the buses disgorge people in clean, simple clothes, their faces etched with a fervor that made her skin prickle. They didn't wave. They just looked at the mountains with the calculating eyes of conquerors. Reverend King, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice like honey over gravel, proclaimed they would heal the land scarred by greed, and build a Zion in the hills. They started with the old company store, turning it into a church. They cleared fields for communal farming. But their real interest was the mountain itself. King preached that God had buried a second covenant in the rock, not stone tablets, but veins of a pure coal, a gospel carbon that would burn clean and eternal, a symbol of their righteous fire. His followers, wielding modern tools, reopened the sealed drift mouth of the Judas mine, the deepest and most played out of the old works. Lena's papa, who'd lost his lungs and his brother to the Judas, spat into the dirt when he heard that mine's a liar. Took men's breath and gave 'em back black spit. Took promises and gave back cave-ins. Its name ain't for nothing. The lambs worked with frightening efficiency. They reinforced shafts, installed new ventilation, and began extracting coal. But it wasn't normal coal. It was jet black, certainly, but it had a strange, vitreous sheen, and when struck, it rang with a faint, discordant chime. They burned it in their new generator, and the light it produced was a cold, blue-white that cast long, sharp shadows and made everyone's eyes look hollow. Then the changes began. The lambs, once fervent, became synchronized. They moved with a uniform, economical grace. Their individual personalities seemed to sand away, replaced by a serene, shared purpose. They stopped singing hymns and instead, at night, would gather and emit a low, harmonic hum that resonated with the generator's thrum. The trees around their compound began to wither, not from pollution, but as if the sap itself had turned sluggish and dark. Lena, a nightwalker by habit and necessity, started seeing things. Figures standing perfectly still in the woods, facing the mine. Not watching, just oriented. She found patches of earth where the soil had turned to a fine, black graphite-like powder. And one night, she heard it. A deep, rhythmic thump coming from the mountain, not from the mine entrance, but from the very rock, a slow, planetary heartbeat. Reverend King came to her trailer. He looked paler, his eyes brighter. Lena, the mountain is awakening to the truth. It's shedding its corrupt, outer shell. Join us. Be part of the refining fire. He held out a lump of the Judas coal. Up close, she saw it wasn't featureless. Fine, intricate lines swirled within it, like fossilized circuitry or the veins in a petrified leaf. It was made of tiny, compressed patterns. She refused, slamming the door. That night, someone left a basket of the strange coal on her steps. It pulsed with a faint, inner light, like a dead star. Driven by fear for her hollow and a desperate need to understand, Lena ventured into the forgotten corners of the Judas mine, using old maps Papa had kept. She avoided the lambs' active works, slipping into an abandoned air shaft. The deeper she went, the warmer it got, but the heat was dry and scentless. The coal here looked different. Not just black, but void, absorbing her headlamp beam hungrily. And the patterns were stronger, clearer. They weren't random. They were recursive, mathematical, a crystalline scripture of pressure and time. In a low chamber, her light fell on a figure. It was one of the lambs, a woman she recognized from the store. She was kneeling, perfectly still, her hands pressed against a coal seam. Tendrils of inky blackness, like crude oil but solid, had grown from the seam over her fingers, up her arms, across her face. She was being incorporated. Her eyes were open, reflecting the coal's inner latticework. She wasn't dead. She was reading, becoming part of the text. Lena fled. She understood now. The Judas mine wasn't yielding coal. It was a library, or a seed. The gospel carbon was a mineral ideology, a slow, geological thought process made manifest. Reverend King hadn't found God in the mountain. He'd found a patient, assimilative intelligence that had slept in the carbon for 300 million years. It wasn't evil, it was just complete. It offered perfect, silent unity, the end of loneliness, of doubt, of self. It converted organic life into ordered carbon, adding new data to its ancient, lithic memory. The lambs weren't building Zion. They were feeding a fossilized God. The hum was its liturgy. The generator was its pulsing heart. The mountain was slowly turning itself and everything in it into a perfect, black diamond of information. Lena tried to warn the few remaining locals. They thought the coal dust had gotten to her. The sheriff, now spending more time at the lambs' compound, just smiled a serene, empty smile. The final stage began with a sound like a continent grinding its teeth. From the Judas mine, thick, obsidian columns began to grow, not erupting, but extruding, forming perfect, hexagonal spires that pierced the ground around the compound. The trees snapped as they were encased in a creeping, crystalline black crust. The lambs gathered at the base of the largest spire, humming their harmonic tone. Reverend King stood before them, his body half translucent, his veins dark and geometric against his skin. He was the conduit. Lena took her papa's old truck and fled up the winding hollow road. In the rearview mirror, she saw the spires multiply, a black cathedral rising from the heart of the mountain, cold and precise and eternal. The blue-white light from the compound intensified, then focused into a single, blinding beam that shot into the sky, not like a beacon, but like a needle-thin root, seeking connection. She didn't know if it was reaching for heaven or for other, similar nodes in the planet's crust. She just knew Redemption Hollow was gone. It had been rewritten into a silent, carbon scripture. The Judas Road had finally found its true destination. Not salvation, but seamless, silent integration. The mountain had preached its final, wordless sermon, and the congregation had become the church. 5. The Well of Missing Faces. The art colony at Briar Rose Lodge was built on a foundation of picturesque decay and trust fund money. For the poets and painters seeking authentic melancholy, the nearby dying town of Mercy, West Virginia, was a perfect muse. Alara, a photographer from Brooklyn, came for the light, the way it fell through the polluted haze of the river valley, creating a perpetual, golden hour gloom. Her muse became the town's last remaining curiosity, the Face Well. It was a stone culvert in the woods behind the abandoned mirror factory, where a sulfur spring bubbled up. The legend, told by a grizzled local at the dying general store, was that the mirror factory's runoff, full of silver nitrate and other toxins, had seeped into the spring a century ago. Now, if you looked into the water at dusk, you might see a face looking back. Not your reflection, but someone else's. A face lost to the hollow. People who looked too long, it was said, sometimes went missing, leaving behind only a strange, blank calm. Alara dismissed it as a campfire story for depressed artists. But the well was photogenic. The water was a milky, opalescent blue, and the stone was stained with rainbow chemical slicks. She started taking portraits of it at different times of day. The first anomaly was in the digital preview screen. A shot taken in late afternoon seemed to show a faint, woman's face just under the water's surface, eyes closed. When she pulled it up on her laptop, it was gone, just a trick of light on algae. She thought nothing of it. Then she developed a roll of black and white film. In one frame, clear as day, was the face of a young man with sad eyes and a working man's cap, gazing up from the well. It wasn't in the water. It seemed to be of the water, its features formed by the swirls and bubbles. Her heart hammered. It was no double exposure. She showed it to the other artists. They were delighted. A genius capture. The genius loci. They saw it as art, not evidence. Alara became obsessed. She spent hours by the well, watching. She never saw a face in the moment, only on film or in the peripheral blur of a long exposure. She began to research the town's history, scouring microfiche in the library for reports of disappearances. She found many. A farmer in 1912, a mirror polisher in 1938, a teenager in 1974. Their descriptions matched some of the faces she'd caught. The sad-eyed man was Leo Briggs, lost in 38. The other artists started to change. Martin, a formerly angsty poet, became preternaturally serene. He stopped writing about suffering and began producing simple, haiku-like verses about stillness and silence. His face, once expressive, grew placid, almost blank. Cora, a painter, abandoned her violent abstract canvases and started painting photorealistic portraits of strangers, faces Alara recognized from her own photographs of the well. They painted with a disturbing, mechanical precision, and their eyes, like Martin's, had lost their inner light. The well wasn't stealing people. It was stealing their interiors, their pain, their memories, their turbulent selves. It was offering a terrible trade. Relief from the burden of being someone in exchange for becoming a vessel. The chemical soup had created a psychic sump, a place where the mountain sluiced away unwanted identity, leaving behind empty, peaceful shells. The missing faces in the water were the echoes of those selves, trapped in the reflective poison. Alara tried to stop, but her own art was fueled by a deep, personal sadness, a brother lost to an overdose, a childhood of quiet dysfunction. The well called to that sadness. It promised a release she could feel in her bones. One evening, staring into the opalescent water, she saw not a stranger's face, but her own. It looked back at her, not with her familiar anxiety, but with a profound, empty peace. It was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She raised her camera almost against her will. The click of the shutter echoed in the silent woods. In that moment, she felt a sudden, dizzying lurch, as if a core piece of her had been siphoned out through her eyes. The weight of her brother's memory, the constant ache of it, was gone. She felt light, clear, empty, and blissful. Back at the lodge, she looked at the image. It was a perfect portrait of her own face, serene and vacuous as a porcelain doll's, floating in the well water. She felt no pride, no horror. Just calm. She deleted her entire portfolio, every image of grief and beauty she'd ever made. It all seemed so noisy now. The next morning, she packed her things. Martin and Cora waved a slow, synchronized goodbye from the porch, their smiles identical and empty. Alara drove away from Mercy, never looking back. She got a job in data entry in a bland suburb. She is perfectly content. She has no nightmares, no regrets, no burning desire to create. She is a clean, quiet room. But sometimes, on rare nights when the wind is right, she feels a faint, chemical tingle on her skin, and a face will surface in her mind's eye. Not her own, but one of the lost ones from the well, Leo Briggs or the farmer or the teen, their features etched in silver nitrate sorrow. And for a fleeting second, she will remember what it was to feel a wound, to have a story. Then the memory slips back into the deep, quiet water inside her, and the perfect, peaceful silence returns. The well has her face now, and she has its silence. The transaction is complete. #6. The holler that echoed back. Sam and Dean, brothers from Dayton, didn't believe in local legends. They believed in content. Their YouTube channel, Backwater Bazaar, specialized in debunking hillbilly horror stories. The tale of Echo Holler in eastern Kentucky was perfect fodder, a place where sounds didn't fade, but got trapped, bouncing between the narrow ridges for days, sometimes years, before being spat back out at random. Ghostly wagon wheels, phantom gunshots, whispered conversations from the Depression. Acoustic anomaly, Sam declared, setting up his high-end digital recorders and parabolic mics. Probably a unique geological formation. We'll record it, analyze the waveform, and show these rubes it's just rocks. The holler was a deep, green slit in the world, damp and silent as a tomb. Their footsteps on the leaf litter seemed muffled, absorbed. Dean, the on-camera personality, hammed it up. All right, Echo Holler. Give us your best shot. Whisper your secrets. He fired his starter pistol in the air. The bang was shockingly loud, but the echo that returned wasn't a decaying repetition. It was different. It was the crack of a much older rifle, followed by a faint, receding scream that seemed to come from every direction at once. The brothers exchanged a glance. Cool, Dean said, uneasily. They played back the recording. The waveform was nonsense. A chaotic, layered spike that shouldn't have been possible. Sam's rational explanation began to fray. They decided to spend the night, to capture the famous, night echoes. As dark fell, the holler came alive with sound. But not with wildlife. They heard the clop-clop of invisible horse hooves on stone, a child's laughter that looped for 5 solid minutes, a fragment of a bitter argument. Asterisk, ain't got no choice. The bank's talkin'. It all. Asterisk, the recorders captured it all. Pristine, as if the events were happening live in a studio. Then Sam had the idea. If it echoes back sounds, what if we give it a new one? Something unique. A control. He took out his phone and played a 10-second clip of a pop song, loudly. The synth beats and auto-tuned vocals were grotesquely out of place in the primordial dark. The holler swallowed the sound whole. Nothing echoed back. See, Sam said, triumphant. It only replays old, traumatic events. It's a psychic impression, not an acoustic one. We've cracked it. But the holler had been listening. And learning. The first echo returned an hour later. It was Dean's voice, from earlier that day. Whisper your secrets. But it was twisted, slowed down, layered with a wet, gurgling undertone. It was followed by Sam's pop song clip. But now it was stretched into a 2-minute drone, the melody distorted into a minor key dirge, mixed with the sound of tearing fabric and a single, choked sob. The holler wasn't just a tape recorder. It was a composer. It was using their sounds as raw material. Panic set in. They tried to leave. The path they'd come in on was gone, overgrown as if untouched for decades. Their GPS was useless, showing them spinning in place. The batteries in their equipment, fully charged, drained in minutes. They were trapped in the sound box. The echoes became more frequent, more personal. They heard their own private conversations from the car ride down, arguments about their channel's direction, Sam's confession of his secret debt. The holler played them back, edited for maximum cruelty, interspersed with the sounds of breaking glass and falling trees. It was learning their emotional vocabulary. Then it started to create. A new sound emerged. The distinct, sickening crunch of a leg bone snapping, followed by Dean's voice screaming in agony, a scream that hadn't happened yet. They huddled in their tent, hands over their ears, but the sounds were inside their heads, vibrating in their teeth. We have to apologize, Sam whispered, pale. We mocked it. We fed it poison. We have to take it back. At dawn, trembling, They stood in the center of the holler. Sam held up his recorder, now a useless brick. "We're sorry," he shouted, his voice breaking. "We were wrong. This isn't an anomaly. It's yours. We take it back. We take our sound back." Silence. Then, a low, tectonic rumble gathered in the stone beneath their feet. It wasn't an echo of anything. It was the holler's own voice. It spoke using their tools. It played back Dean's jovial, "All right, echo holler." But it spliced it with Sam's pop song, the rifle crack, the child's laughter, the bone crunch, and their own whispered fears, all woven into a single, horrific, seamless composition. It was the holler's masterpiece. Its first original work. The sound didn't hit their ears. It hit their bodies. Dean convulsed, clutching his stomach as if gut-punched. Sam felt his mind unraveling, the coherent threads of his thoughts shredded by the auditory barrage. They weren't being attacked. They were being performed. When the sound finally faded, they were different. Dean could no longer hear human speech, only layers of noise that he couldn't parse. Sam's mind was a permanent echo chamber, every thought bouncing back at him in a distorted, mocking version. They stumbled out of the holler, which now freely gave up its path, their mission accomplished. Their channel went dead. They were found weeks later, wandering a highway 50 miles away. Dean communicates only through screams and whimpers that he seems to be carefully, agonizingly tuning. Sam writes long, looping manuscripts that are just the same sentence, copied thousands of times, each iteration subtly altered, degrading. Echo holler is quiet again. But if you go there, and listen very carefully in the dead of night, you might hear something new beneath the old ghosts. A complex, evolving soundscape, a dark symphony of stolen voices and learned pain. It's practicing. It's found its purpose. It's no longer just an echo. It's an artist. And it's always looking for new material. Thank you so much for watching this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment and turn on notifications if you enjoyed the video so you never miss an upload.